5 figures moved through the dark in a line, their lantern light swinging low over the concrete. Crates first, passed hand to hand down the ladder, the metal groaning under each weight. Then the ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, carried last and carried carefully, like something that might bruise. No one spoke above a whisper. Above them the silo held its grain in patient towers, indifferent to what was being done beneath its feet. When the final crate settled onto its shelf, someone pulled a chain and a bare bulb lit the room in yellow, and for a moment 5 faces looked at each other across the small space, memorizing it. Then the light went out, the hatch swung shut, and grain dust sifted down over the seam until the floor above looked exactly as it always had. 37 years later, the silo stood the way condemned things stand, patient, sagging, waiting for someone to finish what neglect had started. She parked her car in its shade, because the shade was free, and because the man from the county had said 3 days, cash at the end, if she didn't mind heights and didn't mind spiders. She minded neither. She minded empty gas tanks and empty stomachs, and 3 days of pay solved both. The co-op had failed sometime before she was born, though the sign out front, Harvest Growers Assen, EST, 1948, still hung by one bolt, swinging when the wind found it. Weeds had reclaimed the loading yard. The office windows were empty sockets. Only the silo itself remained mostly whole, a gray concrete cylinder rising 80 feet into a sky the color of dishwater, waiting for an auctioneer's gavel to decide what happened to what was left inside. The liquidation agent had been blunt about the job. Strip the copper wiring, pull any usable conduit, clear loose scrap from the interior so the buyer, whoever they turned out to be, wouldn't have to pay someone else to do it first. 3 days. Cash. No questions about her car parked out back. No questions about why a 20-year-old was doing work most men her age wouldn't touch. She'd learned to read that kind of silence as a kindness. She took it. Inside, the silo breathed old grain dust and rust. Sunlight came down in blades, through gaps in the roof, cutting the dark into pieces. She worked methodically, the way she worked everything. Start at the entrance, move inward, note what she saw before she touched it. Wire coiled like dead snakes along the walls. A ladder bolted to the interior, rungs eaten thin with rust, climbing up toward the roof vents where it belonged. But there was another ladder. Smaller, half hidden behind a collapsed grain chute, its rungs descending instead of climbing, heading down, past the floor line, into a dark that had no obvious reason to exist in a building built only to hold grain. She stood at its edge a long moment, flashlight in one hand, the co-op's 3-day clock already ticking somewhere behind her. She crouched and ran her thumb along the bolt heads anchoring the smaller ladder to the concrete. They weren't grain bin hardware, too thick, too deep, sunk into the wall like they'd been meant to hold weight for decades rather than a season. The standard silo ladder above her, the one climbing toward the roof vents, used lag screws spaced for a man checking bin levels twice a year. This one had carriage bolts, 4 to a rung, countersunk and painted over more than once. Someone had wanted it permanent, someone had wanted it to last. She traced the beam of her flashlight along the collapsed grain chute that half buried the opening. It had come down sometime after the ladder was installed, not before. The chute's broken edge rested against the 3rd rung down, bending it slightly outward, and rust had bloomed around that bend in a pattern that told her the metal had been bent first, then left to weather for years. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody had needed to, which meant nobody had used this ladder in a long time. She sat back on her heels and did what she always did before spending effort she couldn't afford to waste. She asked what didn't make sense. A grain silo held grain. It needed a floor to hold grain, walls to contain it, an auger to move it, vents to keep it from rotting into itself. It did not need a ladder descending past the floor line into whatever sat beneath the foundation. Silos didn't have basements. They had footings, maybe a shallow pit for the auger motor, not a passage. Dust motes turned slow in the blade of light from the roof gap above her. Somewhere outside, a truck downshifted on the county road, the sound flattening out over the flat fields the way sound did here, carrying farther than it should. She thought about the 3 days ticking down, about the buyer who wanted the metal stripped and hauled, and the concrete shell left standing empty for auction photographs. Nobody had said anything about what was under the floor. Nobody probably knew. She could leave it. Scrap the augers, coil the wire, take her cash, drive on to wherever the next 3-day job turned up. That was the sensible math, the kind she'd trained herself to do without sentiment, because sentiment didn't buy gas or keep the car running through another cold snap. But she'd learned something else too, drifting from one forgotten place to another, that things built to last, built with more care than they needed, usually held a reason worth knowing. Nobody bolted carriage screws into concrete for nothing. She wedged the flashlight between her teeth, gripped the top rung, and tested her weight against it. It held. Rust flaked away under her palm like old paint, but the bolt beneath stayed fixed, stubborn, unmoved by 40 years of silence. She started down. The ladder ran 12 feet past the collapsed grain floor before her boot found nothing but air, then a lip of poured concrete, then a flat surface she could stand on without the metal groaning beneath her. She swept the flashlight low, a hatch, waist-high, set into a wall that had no business existing inside a grain silo, square-cornered, deliberate, framed in steel that someone had painted and repainted against the damp. Rust had eaten the paint down to lace. A wheel valve, the kind she'd seen on the pressure tanks behind the feed store, sat at its center, seized solid. She braced her boots, gripped the wheel with both hands, and threw her weight against it. Nothing. She backed off, found the can of penetrating oil she'd carried down in her jacket pocket without quite deciding to, and worked it into the seam, waiting, breathing the mineral cold of the place. When she tried again, the wheel gave half an inch, with a sound like something exhaling after a long time holding its breath. In 1962, the concrete was still green, still curing under burlap sacks kept wet by a boy with a garden hose, and the argument was happening again, the same argument that had happened every week since the digging started. One of the men wanted the room smaller, said the cost of steel plate for the hatch alone could buy a used truck, said his family had contributed enough already and didn't see why they should build storage for 4 other households besides their own. He said it standing in the mud at the edge of the excavation, hat in his hands, not quite looking at the woman across from him. She didn't raise her voice. She never did, which was somehow worse for the men who wanted an argument they could win by volume. She said if the sirens ever went off for real, nobody in this town would care whose name was on the deed. She said a shelter built for one family was just a fallout cellar with a fence around it, and what good was that when the schoolhouse was 2 miles off, and half the children in this county would be caught in the open. She said either it held everyone, or it wasn't worth pouring the concrete at all. The other men had gone quiet, the way men did when someone said the true thing, plainly enough that arguing against it became embarrassing. One of them finally nodded and picked up a shovel. The boy with the hose kept the burlap wet. The wheel spun free at last, and the hatch swung inward on hinges someone had greased with real care 40 years ago, expecting it to be opened again far sooner than this. Cold, dry air moved past her face, air that smelled of nothing, No mildew, no rot, just still concrete and old metal, a room that had been sealed so well it had simply stopped participating in time. She lowered the flashlight beam through the opening and saw the edge of a metal bunk frame, a shelf lined with tins, the corner of something that might have been a radio. She ducked her head and climbed through. The room was smaller than she expected, maybe 10 feet by 14, the ceiling low enough that she had to bend her neck once she stood full height on the concrete floor. Her boots left prints in a fine gray dust that had settled undisturbed for who knew how long. She swept the flashlight in a slow arc, and the beam caught 4 bunk frames bolted to the walls in pairs, thin metal frames with the canvas webbing long since rotted to gray threads, and above them a shelf running the length of one wall, lined with tins. She stepped closer. The labels had faded to pale ghosts of print, but she could make out shapes that might have said beans, might have said water, rows of cans stacked with a precision that spoke of someone who had taken inventory seriously, who had wanted to know exactly what they had and exactly what they didn't. Beside the tins sat coils of rope, a hand axe, a first aid kit with a faded red cross, gone the color of rust, and on a low table bolted to the far wall, a radio, boxy, metal-cased, with a crank handle folded flat against its side like a sleeping arm. She touched the crank. It moved, stiff but not frozen, and some small, reckless part of her wanted to turn it right then, just to see if the thing still had a voice in it after 37 years. She didn't. Not yet. She kept the light moving instead, cataloging before she disturbed anything, the way she'd learned to do in every place she'd ever passed through, and needed to understand quickly. Read the room before you touch the room. That was when she saw the logbook. It sat on a narrow shelf near the hatch, as if placed there deliberately for whoever came down next. A plain black cover with a strip of tape gone brittle and yellow along its spine. She lifted it with both hands, careful of the binding, and opened the cover. The paper inside had yellowed but held, and stamped across the top in blue ink, faded but legible, was a date. 1962. Below it, in a hand that pressed hard into the page, someone had written a single line before the entries began, something about provisions counted and shelter complete, and beneath that, a column of names she didn't recognize yet, 5 surnames repeated in different combinations down the page, initials beside dates, small check marks in a rotation she didn't yet understand. She sat down on the edge of the nearest bunk frame, the metal cold through her jeans, and read the first page twice. Somewhere above her, faint through 30 feet of collapsed grain floor and the rusted ladder she'd climbed down, she could hear nothing at all. No wind, no birds, no truck engine idling in the co-op yard where the liquidation agent's clipboard was waiting on the dashboard. Down here there was only the flashlight beam, the tins, the radio, and this book, and the sense that whatever this room had been built for, it had never once been used the way it was meant to be. She turned the page. The names sorted themselves into a pattern once she stopped trying to read them as strangers. 5 surnames, repeated in rotation down the page: Hollis, Beckett, Fenn, Cray, Osgood, each one paired with initials, dates every few weeks through the spring and summer of 1962, then spacing out through the fall. A checklist beside each entry. Water changed, batteries tested, roof seal inspected, floor swept. Someone had taken this seriously enough to make a system out of it. Someone had expected to need it. She traced a finger down to Osgood and stopped. She'd passed that name 100 times without meaning to, stenciled in faded paint on a mailbox at the edge of town, the post leaning, the flag long broken off. She hadn't thought about who lived behind it. Now she did. The flashlight battery was warm against her palm, the beam starting to yellow at the edges, and she made herself close the book before it burned out entirely and left her down here in the dark with only the shape of the room to remember by. Names first, she thought. Figure out who's still around. The lantern threw more shadow than light, but it was enough. 5 families stood shoulder to shoulder in a room that smelled of wet concrete and pine sap, their coats still damp from the walk down through the grain floor hatch, boots gray with the dust of new pour. Someone had brought a jug of cider, passed hand to hand, and someone else had brought the ledger itself, bound stiff, its spine not yet broken in. "Read it back," one of them said, and the man holding the pen did. Slow, the words plain and unadorned, because none of them had patience that year for anything else. Provisions counted, shelter complete. We the undersigned agree to maintain in equal turn 12 weeks each, water and stores checked monthly, radio tested and share alike whatever comes. They signed in order down the page, the pen scratching loud in the small room. 5 names and the year beside each, and when the last signature dried, someone raised the cider jug, and there was a short laugh, more relief than joy, the kind that comes from finishing something heavy. "Nobody outside this room needs to know the particulars," the man with the pen said, not unkindly, just practical, the way people were practical that year about things they hoped never to use. Just that it's here if it's needed. Hands were shaken, plain and firm, 5 grips in turn around the circle, and then the lantern was carried back up the ladder, rung by rung, and the hatch was pulled shut above them, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when they've just been finished and haven't yet been asked to do anything. Down in the dark 37 years later, she opened the book again, the beam steadying as she held it still, and started reading the names a second time, slower now, matching initials to entries, looking for whichever one might still be listed in a phone book somewhere in town, still breathing, still able to say what these 5 families had built down here and why. The 5 names held steady under the flashlight beam, 2 Andersons, a Kowalski, a Trudell, a Reyes. She copied them onto the back of a feed receipt she'd found folded in her jacket pocket, pressing hard enough to leave grooves because she didn't trust herself to remember spelling in the dark. Above her, faint through the hatch and the collapsed floor and all that concrete, she heard boots on the catwalk and a voice calling down into the silo shaft that wasn't looking for her, just checking the schedule. She climbed up fast, knees complaining, and was brushing rust dust off her hands when the liquidation agent's truck door slammed in the yard. He came in already talking, clipboard against his hip, sunglasses pushed up into thinning hair. "Auctions Friday week. County's got it in the paper already. Silo and 40 acres, as is. No contingencies." He looked at the scrap pile she'd dragged out, not large enough for his liking. "You're behind. There's more inside than I figured," she said, which was true in ways she didn't explain. There's always more inside. That's why they pay you by the day and not by the ton. He walked the perimeter, kicked at a fallen conduit pipe, made a note. "Buyer wants it stripped to bare structure, or he walks. Bare structure, understand? Nothing hanging, nothing loose, nothing that looks like a lawsuit waiting to happen. There's a section down low," she started. "Old floors caved. There's a... I don't need the tour." He said it without heat, just tired, a man with a stack of properties and this one near the bottom of the stack. "I need it cleared and I need it quiet. Last thing this sale needs is word getting around town that the place is falling in on itself, or full of somebody's grandfather's junk, or whatever you think you found." People get sentimental, they get lawyers, they get delays, and delays cost me money I don't have room for. You want the rest of this week's pay? You keep your head down and your mouth shut and you finish the job. Understood, she said, because it was easier than the alternative, and because she hadn't decided yet what the alternative even was. He left the way he'd come, gravel spitting under the tires, and she stood in the settling dust holding a feed receipt with 5 names on it, thinking about a logbook that had waited 28 years past its last entry for somebody to open it, and a man upstairs in an office somewhere counting the days until Friday week like it was any other property, any other pile of scrap metal to be hauled off and forgotten. She folded the receipt small and pushed it deep into her jacket pocket, then looked back at the ladder, at the black mouth of the shaft waiting below the grain floor. Bare structure, he'd said. Nothing hanging, nothing loose. She was going to need more time than Friday week gave her, and she didn't yet know who to ask for it. The county records office smelled like paper dust and radiator heat, and the clerk behind the counter didn't ask why a girl in a work jacket wanted deed books from 1961. She gave her the ledger anyway, thick as a phone directory, its spine cracked from decades of being pulled down and shoved back. She found the parcel by its survey markers, cross-referenced against the co-op's original filing, and there it was. Land held jointly. 5 names on the title. No single owner. No banknote against it. The names matched the receipt in her pocket exactly. She wrote them down twice to be sure her hand wasn't inventing agreement where there wasn't any. The library 2 blocks over had the microfilm, spools of local newspaper going back further than the building itself. She fed the machine dimes and turned the crank until her wrist ached, watching headlines scroll past about grain prices and church socials until she landed on a notice from October 1962 about county civil defense drills, families urged to identify safe ground, culverts and cellars listed as approved shelter points. No mention of a silo. No mention of 5 names building something together in secret, but the date lined up close enough to feel like more than coincidence. Down in 1962, the radio in the corner of the unfinished shelter crackled through a drill announcement while 5 people worked room by room, boots scraping concrete still pale from curing. A woman knelt, stacking tins into a shelf, built flush against the wall, counting them under her breath. A man measured rope by arm span and coiled it beside the hand crank set. The broadcast voice talked about 10-day supply minimums, about staying calm, about listening for the all clear, and nobody in the room looked up from what they were doing, because the work mattered more than the voice telling them why. Back in the library, she leaned over the reader until the librarian came to close up, and she left with a folded photocopy of the drill notice pressed between the pages of her notebook, next to the names from the deed. She sat in her car in the library lot with the dome light burning down the battery and tried to fit the 2 things together. Jointly held land, a shelter with no public record, 5 families who'd apparently decided the official shelter points weren't safe enough, or weren't theirs enough, or maybe just weren't close enough to walk to in the dark with children in tow. She thought about the co-op absorbing the land later, folding it into ledgers and grain futures until nobody remembered why the ground had been shared in the first place. Somewhere between 1962 and now, 5 names had become one company name, and one company name was about to become an auction lot. She started the engine, the light dimming as it caught, and pointed the car back toward the silo because there was still the shape of an idea forming and she needed to see the ladder again to know if it would hold. The silo lot was empty when she pulled in, the gravel pale under a 3/4 moon, and she left the headlights on just long enough to find the gap in the fence before cutting them. She'd learned by now which boards gave and which didn't, Which section of chain link sagged low enough to step over without catching a heel. The latter was where she'd left it, cold under her palms, and she went down the way she'd gone down before, counting rungs out of habit, though she no longer needed to. The shelter room held its usual stillness, the flashlight beam sliding over bunks, shelves, the radio she'd already learned to crank without thinking. This time she didn't stop at the obvious. She got down on her knees and ran her hand along the underside of the lowest bunk, the way she'd check the frame of a car for rust she couldn't see from standing. Her fingers found a seam in the concrete behind the bunk supports, a shallow recess bricked with the same gray block as the walls, loose enough that a screwdriver from the tool row popped it after 3 tries. Behind it, a second cache, smaller, drier, hand tools wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age. Cans stacked 2 deep, labels faded to ghost print, some still legible, corn, peaches, evaporated milk, and tucked against the back wall, a folded sheet of paper, thicker than the logbook pages, ruled in pencil, with a hand different from the one that had written the entries upstairs. A calendar, names down the left side, months across the top, check marks and initials filling the grid in a rhythm that held steady year after year, someone coming down to inspect, rotate the cans, wind the radio, note the humidity. The check marks stopped in 1971. She sat back on her heels and looked at the blank months after that, white space where 5 families' handwriting should have kept going. She didn't need the deed photocopy folded in her notebook to know what year the co-op had bought the land, because she'd already memorized it, but she pulled it out anyway and held it next to the calendar under the flashlight, just to watch the 2 dates agree with each other in the dark. Whoever had come down last hadn't packed anything away in a hurry. The cans were still stacked with care, the tools were still wrapped. It read less like abandonment than like people who'd been told, gently or otherwise, that their turn wasn't needed anymore, that the ground under their feet belonged to a company now, and a company didn't send anyone down a ladder to wind a radio nobody was going to use. She sat with that a long moment, the beam trembling slightly on the page, and then she began copying the calendar into her notebook, column by column, name by name, because somewhere in that grid was the answer to a question she hadn't let herself ask yet. Which of the 5 families had stopped coming first, and why? The name at the top of the ledger's 3rd column matched a mailbox she'd passed twice already without stopping, a low white house at the edge of town, with a porch swing that didn't swing anymore, chained still against the wind. She parked the car across the road and walked up gravel that hadn't been raked in a season, and when the door opened it was only a few inches, a chain still latched behind it, an eye squinting into the afternoon light, like it belonged to something nocturnal that resented being disturbed. She said she was working the old co-op silo before the auction, said she'd found a room built underneath it, said she had a logbook with the name on this mailbox written in ink that hadn't faded even after 37 years. The door didn't open any wider. The voice on the other side said the co-op land had nothing to do with anybody anymore, said the family had sold their piece fair and square, said young people had a way of digging up things better left buried and calling it history. She didn't argue. She only said the calendar stopped in March and asked if anyone remembered why. The door stayed shut a long moment, long enough that she nearly turned to leave, and then the chain slid back. Inside, over coffee gone lukewarm in a chipped cup, the story came out sideways, in fragments, like a radio catching a signal only in passing, how 5 households had split lumber and cement and Sunday afternoons to pour that room into the ground before the news made everyone afraid of the sky, how the rotation had held for 9 years out of pure stubborn neighborliness, and how it hadn't been abandonment so much as erosion. One family moved for work, another's children scattered, and when the co-op came with a fair offer for land, nobody wanted to farm alone anymore. There'd been no one left to say no on the shelter's behalf. Nobody had gone back down. Nobody had wanted to. 1962. Cold, poured concrete, still damp at the seams. A woman in a canvas coat stood at the top of the ladder with a padlock in her palm, the hatch cover heavy under her boot. 3 other families' children already climbing up past her into the ordinary daylight of the co-op yard. Someone behind her asked, half joking, if they were building a place to hide from the world. She clicked the lock shut and shook her head without turning. Not hiding, she said. Just being ready. Together, if the world ever asked something of us we couldn't survive alone. At the kitchen table, the coffee cup trembled slightly as it was set down. Nobody ever told the county what was under there, the old voice said. We just let the grain company forget it, same as we did. 3 days. That was what the calendar in the liquidation agent's truck said, a red circle around the auction date like a wound. She found him at the co-op yard, measuring the silo's footprint with a wheel, jotting numbers into a clipboard that would decide, in the language of square footage and scrap tonnage, what the place was worth. I need you to see something before you sell it out from under itself, she said. He didn't look up. I've got a shelter down there full of rusted cans and a radio nobody's used since Kennedy was president. That's not inventory. That's a liability. It's not inventory. It's history. Your buyer's going to strip the concrete for fill, and nobody will ever know 5 families built a room to keep each other alive. He finally looked up, unimpressed, but listening, which was more than she'd gotten from anyone in county government the week before. She'd already gone to the courthouse once, sat across from a records clerk who'd shuffled papers, and said the parcel was slated for demolition permits pending the sale. Not a decision made out of cruelty, just paperwork moving the way paperwork moved, indifferent to the small print of what sat beneath it. She'd asked for the one thing that might slow that gears, and gotten a name, a county historic preservation officer with an office 2 towns over and a habit of answering letters slowly. There was no time to write a letter. She drove there instead, logbook and photographs in a grocery sack on the passenger seat, and stood in a hallway until an appointment opened up. She laid it all out on a metal desk. Names, dates, the rotation agreement, the boilerplate promise scrawled by 5 neighbors who'd decided readiness was a shared duty. She said the town's centennial was coming and asked what other exhibit could show, in one small room, exactly what people were capable of when they built something not for themselves alone. The preservation officer read the logbook twice, called the liquidation agent's office while she sat there, said something about deferring salvage designation pending documentation, said something about historic significance meriting a stay. 3 days became enough, barely. The agent agreed, grudgingly, that she could photograph and log the room properly before crews came through, so long as nothing delayed the sale of everything else. It wasn't preservation. It was a postponement, thin as the concrete ceiling over her head. But it was time. She drove back to the silo grounds as the light went long and gold across the co-op yard, and stood by the hatch with a camera borrowed from the Historical Society, thinking of a woman in a canvas coat who'd once believed a room like this was worth building for people who might never need it. Now, at least, someone believed it was worth remembering. The old woman came back the next morning with a folding chair and a list, names written in a hand that shook now but hadn't in 1962. 2 calls from that list turned into 2 visitors by afternoon. a retired mechanic whose mother's name sat third on the rotation agreement, and a school teacher who recognized her grandfather's hammer among the tools before anyone told her whose it was. Neither had known the room existed. Both stood in the hatchlight a long moment before climbing down, the way people do when a story they'd only half believed turns out to have a floor you can stand on. Work went faster with more hands, though faster still meant careful. The mechanic reset the hand-crank radio's housing, cleaning corrosion from contacts with a toothbrush and patience, until the crank turned smooth again, useless as a radio, useful as proof. The school teacher sorted provisions into labeled trays. Tinned goods, a stack of wool blankets gone stiff with age, a case of batteries long dead, laying them out the way her grandfather might have shelved them, she said, if he'd ever let anyone see this place while he lived. Maren catalogued. She'd learned the habit from the Historical Society's forms and kept at it past exhaustion: item, condition, likely date, notes. She matched crate numbers to names in the logbook, matched names to descendants sitting 3 feet away, matched a decades-old rotation schedule to the actual people whose grandparents had once climbed down here on their assigned Sundays to check the seals and wind the clock. The room stopped being a find and started being a record. They scrubbed concrete with brushes and buckets, hauled down the ladder one at a time. They photographed the bunks before touching them, then reinforced the frames enough to hold weight without collapsing under a visitor's curious hand. They built a small placard from scrap plywood, the old woman dictating wording while the mechanic's level kept the letters straight. Built 1962, by 5 families who agreed no one should face what might come alone. By the third evening, the room held less dust than it had in decades and more light than it ever had. A trouble lamp strung down through the hatch, throwing warm yellow across the shelves. Maren stood at the ladder's base and looked at what 4 people, 3 of them strangers to each other a week before, had made of a sealed room meant to be forgotten. The Centennial Committee wanted a walk-through Friday. The auction, postponed but not canceled, still loomed somewhere past that. She climbed the ladder into the co-op yard's cooling air, dust on her hands, names in her notebook, and understood she was no longer just clearing scrap for cash. She was building the thing the room had always been for, a place people came back to. The Centennial fell on a Saturday warm enough for shirt sleeves, the co-op yard swept clean and strung with paper bunting someone's grandmother had kept folded in a cedar chest since the 50th. Folding chairs faced the silo's base, where the hatch now sat propped open behind a low rope, the trouble lamp still glowing gold from below, like something that had never stopped waiting to be found. In 1962, the 5 families had stood in roughly this same spot, watching a concrete truck back toward a hole in the ground, none of them saying aloud what they were afraid of, all of them signing a logbook instead, because a signature was a smaller thing to carry than a fear. Now the county official read from a typed sheet, and the liquidation agent, coat off, sleeves rolled, looking like a man who'd stopped minding the delay, stood off to the side with his clipboard finally empty of urgency. The old woman sat in the front row with the mechanic and the schoolteacher's granddaughter beside her, 3 names from a logbook made present again. The vote was simple, almost anticlimactic. A show of hands from the town council, then a louder show from the crowd when the mayor asked if anyone objected to withdrawing the silo grounds from auction. No one raised a hand. The liquidation agent didn't either, and that told her more than the vote did. They read the new name off a hand-lettered sign before the county could get a proper one milled. Hollis Grounds. After no family name at all, but after her, the drifter who'd climbed down a ladder that wasn't supposed to be there and come back up with a reason to stay. Afterward, the county official walked her to the caretaker's cottage at the property's edge, small and square, its porch sagging but its bones sound, the kind of place that had clearly been waiting on someone the way the shelter had been waiting on someone to remember it. He told her the position came with modest pay, tool access, and the expectation she'd keep the exhibit running and the grounds mowed. She said yes before he finished the sentence. That evening she sat on the cottage steps with her notebook open on her knee, the names of 5 families and 3 descendants and 1 liquidation agent and 1 county official, all inked in her own uneven hand, and understood the shelter had done exactly what it was built for. 37 years late, but not too late. It had kept someone from facing what came next alone. She closed the notebook, looked once more at the silo standing dark against the evening, and went inside to the first home that was entirely hers.